quality of service. Have you ever had a time where you were in the middle of streaming a video or music over the internet and the stream was broken or affected to the point that it made the video pause, or maybe it was jerky, or the sound cut out or was distorted? Well, often that occurrence can simply be the result of a lack of bandwidth. Obviously, for things like audio and video, there has to be a minimum amount of bandwidth available for that stream to arrive at the destination without being affected in any way. Now, for that reason, CheckPoint supports QoS, or quality of service, because there's times where certain bits of data are more important than others. Now, like in our previous example where streaming video or audio over the network or over the internet, if there's a momentary pause in the data stream, then the audio or the video is going to be broken, or it's going to stutter, and it's not going to have a great experience for the user. Now, on the other hand, if you're downloading a regular file, a momentary pause or a drop in speed really isn't going to change much. It's just going to result in a slightly slower download. And the truth is, you probably won't even notice the change. So this is where QoS can help things along. It can place a higher priority on data that needs a sustained amount of bandwidth, and then lower the priority on things that really don't have to maintain a certain level of performance. Now, the first step in configuring QoS is to define the global properties. That is, the settings that will apply to all of our QoS rules. So, in our CheckPoint Smart Dashboard, where we are right now, we're going to head up the top here to the Policy menu, and at the bottom we'll choose Global Properties, and on the left here we'll select QoS. Now, the truth is, you don't have to modify any of these values you see here at all. You could happily leave these at their defaults if you prefer to do that, and in most cases you'll probably only consider changing this unit of measure here to something else. Now, currently it's set to display in kilobits, and I'm going to select the next one here to display in kilobytes, but depending on the way in which you want your unit of measure displayed, you could just change it as you see fit. So at the top here we can see that the weight of rules is currently set to a maximum of 1000, and any new rules will default to having a weight of 10. And we'll see later on how this weight value affects our rules. For now though, just remember that the default here is 10, and the maximum weight we'll set here is 1000, and these things are going to make more sense later on. Now finally, at the bottom here we're able to set authentication timeouts for QoS. Firstly, for users that have already been authenticated, any connections that are opened within whatever value is set here, which defaults to 15 minutes, then these connections will be guaranteed the amount of bandwidth that's specified in your quality of service policy. Similarly, if a user has tried and they've failed to be authenticated, then any connections within 5 minutes, they won't be guaranteed any amount of bandwidth. And finally, any unanswered queries will expire after 3 minutes. Now, since QoS isn't something that's enabled by default, we will need to enable it on our gateways. So in our Smart Dashboard here, I'm going to double click on my gateway, cpgate-LA, and in the middle here in the CheckPoint Products area, we're going to scroll down and we'll locate QoS and we'll put a check in that box. Then on the left hand side of this window, up the top here, we're going to select Topology. And do note here that in the right hand side of this console, we already have our interfaces that we set up in an earlier video. But if you don't see your interfaces listed here, then you can choose the Get button and populate this window here. Now, once you've done that, you can double click on any interface and there'll be this Qos tab. So if we select that, this allows us to define Qos settings that are specific to this interface. So here we can set both inbound and outbound data rates, or in other words, we could set how much bandwidth will allow these interfaces to use. And it's really important to realize though, that in order to get the best out of this feature, you will need to know what the actual bandwidth limitation of your interfaces are. Because if we were to say, check this outbound active interface and we'll set the outbound rate to say 10 meg, and let's assume our interface is a 100 meg one, then this interface will only ever use 10 meg. And you're really shortchanging yourself and you're not making full use of the bandwidth. Of course, the opposite's true as well, whereby you might have hardware that's capable of 10 meg and you set it to 100. Well, then your rules aren't really going to be accurate, since CheckPoint is going to try and throw out more data than your hardware can handle. So if you can, and of course you can, take the time and set these things right. So for the sake of the argument here for my lab, I'm going to set both of them to 10 meg. And we'll click on OK, and we'll click OK one more time. Now the next thing we'll need to do is to display the Qos tab, because right now at the top here, we can't see it anywhere. So to do that, we're going to click the File menu, and then we'll select Add Policy Type to Package. We'll need to save our existing policy. Now here we can select QoS, and I'm going to leave the default in traditional mode, and we'll click OK. And over here on the right we can see the Qos tab. So this tab here is where we can craft our QoS rules to determine what sort of traffic gets priority over other sorts of traffic. And you'll immediately notice that this window carries the exact same look and feel that we've been seeing when we've created our regular firewall security rules in earlier videos. So we've got our name of the rule, in this case we've got a default rule, the source, the destination and the service columns, they should all be pretty familiar to you by now. That's where the data is coming from, where it's going, and what sort of protocol is being used. Now I'm going to come back to this action column here. We'll just scroll across to the right. Next we have the track column, so we can elect whether we want to log this traffic. Install on is where we can define which gateways we want this rule being installed on. Time, this allows us to make this rule active at a certain time of day, and then comment speaks for itself, being a place where you can write comments about this rule. Well, since most of the columns here are self-explanatory to anyone who's watched the earlier videos where we created our security rules, the other two important ones to understand really are the action column and probably our time column. As these two here, they're going to play an important part in laying down your quality of service policy, in particular the action column. So because of that, let's start with our time column here. Now, it's probably obvious straight away that the time column has to do with time, specifically what time of day this rule is active. And that's a good thing, because there will be times that you want to allow certain types of traffic to use more bandwidth than other times. For example, you might want to allow people in your company to browse the web, but you want to push that traffic way down the priority list during business hours, since it's not really that important to your business, but after say 5 o'clock, then downloading from the web using HTTP, that can run at full speed. So let's use that as an example, since it's exactly this type of rule that's a popular one to configure. So since this rule here that we're currently looking at is the default catch-all rule, we'll need to add another one above it. So we're going to right click and we'll choose Add Rule Above. And let's make this a rule for outbound internet access. So I'm just going to give it a name. I'll call it Web Outbound. And we'll go and click on OK. Now for the source here, we'll right click, we'll choose Add. And I'm going to locate my LA network and we'll choose OK. Now I'm going to leave the destination here at any, since for this example we want to throttle access to the internet using HTTP, and the destination of course could be anywhere. So in the service column we're going to right click and choose Add, and we're going to locate HTTP and choose OK. Alright, well the next column we have here is the action column. And the default value here is a weight of 10. Now, this is where these rules can become a little confusing for some people. Now, firstly, you might recall a little earlier in this video when we configured the global properties, and let's quickly go back there by clicking on Policy, Global Properties, and then QoS. Now, over here on the right, you can see that the default value for any new rule, the default weight, is currently set to 10. For a start, that's where this weight of 10 comes from. And of course we can change this value as well if we like, but let's right click it here for now and we'll choose Edit Properties, because in addition to this weight value, we've got some other options as well. Okay, so we have two types of rules we can work with here. We've got simple and advanced. So I'm going to switch to the advanced rule since we have all of the simple options and more. So this is going to give us an overview of all of the different types of configuration options we have with these rules. So the first option we have here is to have this rule apply only to encrypted traffic. Now next is the rule weight, which we've already spoken about briefly. So let's talk more about this weight value. The weight value is a value that we can set for a rule, but the effect this has will also be determined by other rules that are active and the weight that's been specified for them. So let's look at this, and to be honest, it's probably going to be easy to understand if I write it down. So let's go and fire up Notepad here for a second. And we'll say that HTTP is going to have a weight of 10. Now, let's say that we want to add another protocol. Let's say FTP. We'll add that to our QoS rules, and we'll create a new rule for FTP. We'll also give it a weight of 10 as well. All right, now let's throw in one more. We'll say throw in Telnet, and we're going to give that a weight of 10 as well. Okay, well, what we have now, we've defined three different types of traffic, HTTP, FTP, and Telnet, and given each of them equal weighting of 10. So what does that mean in the real world? Well, it means absolutely nothing if the link isn't being 100% used, because these weighted rules only kick in when the link is 100% saturated. So let's assume for the moment that our link is chock full of data and people are hitting it hard. Well, in that case, it means that we'll need to do some calculations to see what each of these protocols here are capable of using. Now, I purposely chose to leave the default values of 10 here for each of these protocols since it makes working this out pretty easy. The way we'll do it is to tally up all of the values, and that's pretty simple. 10 plus 10 plus 10 equals 30. So our total weighting is 30, which is an arbitrary value, which in our case simply means 100% of our total bandwidth. So let's assume that we've got three active connections all using up our bandwidth. And since all three of these all have the exact same weighting, the result is that all three connections will consume an equal amount of bandwidth. Therefore, this total weighting here of 30 really doesn't mean all that much yet. Now, to work it out, what we'll do is we'll fire up the Windows calculator, and what we'll do here is we'll enter in 10 and we'll divide that into our total weighting of 30, and then we'll times that by 100, and that'll give us the total percentage of bandwidth, which you can see is 33%. So obviously each of these here are going to add up to having 33% of the total bandwidth. But let's say we were to change one of these. Let's change FTP here to have a weighting of 25. Well, our total weighting now is 45. So to understand what effect this is going to have on our bandwidth, we'll use our calculator again, and we'll calculate FTP, which is 25. We'll divide that into our total weighting of 45, and then we'll times that by 100, and we have 55%. So 55% of our total bandwidth can be used by FTP. Now, and I want to try and make this clear, FTP could be using 100% of our bandwidth at any time. So could HTTP, and so could Telnet as well. These weighting values we're talking about here, they're only relevant when the link is firstly at 100% utilization. And secondly, the calculations we just did are also only relevant when all three of these protocols are being used. Now what I mean by that is, let's say our link is sitting there currently at, we'll say 80% capacity. Now, if that's the case, none of these QoS rules are in effect. None of them. If the link, however, is at 100% utilization, and all three of these protocols are being used, HTTP, FTP and Telnet, then HTTP is going to get around 22% of the bandwidth, FTP is going to get around 55%, and Telnet will get 22% as well. But let's say there isn't any Telnet traffic going on, and the link is currently at 100%. Then these calculations here are going to be different. In that case, we would find our total weighting would be 35, 10 plus 25 is 35, and then that would mean that HTTP is going to have 10 over 35 times 100. So it's going to get about 28.5% of the bandwidth, and therefore, if my calculation's correct, it's going to leave 71.5% of the bandwidth for use by FTP. So, as you can see, it could be a little confusing to newcomers how this weighting works, but it really isn't all that hard. You've just got to remember a couple of rules and you're good. Firstly, if the link isn't at 100% utilization, then none of these rules here even matter. Secondly, if the link is at 100% and then QoS does come into play, only those rules that match any active connections will be considered. So if there's no FTP traffic happening right now, then take that one out of the equation and the rest of the rules that are active will determine the total weighting. So weightings are useful because they pretty much mean that even if one type of traffic is currently hogging all of the bandwidth, let's say we've got several FTP connections that's consuming 100% of our bandwidth right now, and then someone goes and starts up a Telnet connection. It does mean that with the right rules in place, that this Telnet user will still have some bandwidth for their traffic. The FTP users would then be throttled to make way. Now also realize, when it comes to these rules, the QoS policy works on a first match principle, meaning that if you've got two rules that could match a given situation, then the rule that gets evaluated first will be the effective result. So, for example, if we have a web rule that gives HTTP a weighting of 30, and then we have another rule that targets users in the marketing department, for argument's sake, and that gives HTTP a weighting of 10, then whenever HTTP is being used, even by those users in the marketing department, it would have a weighting of 30 because that rule appears first in the list. So, in summary regarding weighting, just think of weighting as a percentage. What percentage of the total bandwidth do you want to use for certain types of traffic? But don't think that it's only limited to protocols though. You could apply the same rule to a whole department. So one department, such as managers, could get a higher priority over the salespeople and so forth. But you probably already realised that because that, of course, is what these destination columns here are for. Alright, with weighting out of the way, the other option we have here, and let's just bring up that window again, are for rule limit and per connection limit. And both of these are much easier to understand than weighting really, since here you're just going to enter in a value for how much bandwidth you want the whole rule to use or for each connection to use. So that's much easier. Now at the bottom here, our final option is guarantee, where we can define an amount of bandwidth that will guarantee either a rule or a connection. So here we could say that HTTP is guaranteed to get 1 meg of bandwidth at any time, and all other rules will then be allocated whatever bandwidth is left, and that'll be according to the weighting that you've specified. Okay, well, let's just give this rule, we'll give it a weighting of say 30, and we'll click on OK, and we can see that change referenced here. Now, another thing that we can do with our QoS rules is to create subrules, which, as you might have guessed, are rules that you can create within a rule. So if we were to right click on our web rule here, and we'll select the third option to add a subrule, first thing we'll need to do is give this rule a name, of course. So I'm going to call this one LA, and we'll click on OK, and notice here on the left hand side this puts a new LA subrule underneath our existing web outbound rule. And notice that it actually creates a whole new subrule section, and this new sub-rule section has two rules. The one that we're actively creating, this LA rule, and the default catch-all rule as well. So let's quickly click on our web outbound rule first. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to delete our LA network from our source. And that means that our rule here is now giving HTTP a weight of 30 regardless of wherever it's coming from. So let's go back to our LA subrule, and for the sake of the argument, let's just assume that we've already created multiple locations. So to select one, in this case LA, we'll simply right click here in our source column, we'll choose add. We'll select the location that we want to add. In this case it's going to be our LA network, and we'll click OK. Now we could create another rule if we liked, either above or below this LA rule, for our New York network, for our London network, for our Sydney network, and so forth if we liked, and we can adjust these weightings accordingly based on what our business requirements are. The thing is though, when you take this sort of structure into consideration, is that our original web rule here, you'll recall, in fact you can see, has a weighting of 30. Well, any sub-rules, since they fall under this original web rule, then they'll only ever be able to get a percentage of the bandwidth that the web rule's able to get. Now the other thing to remember with these sub-rules is that in order for them to actually work and do what you expect them to do, this means that the source, the destination, and the service columns, they have to be a subset of the parent rule, or they just won't do anything. I mean, if the parent rule has the source set for our LA network, then you can't go and create a sub-rule and target the source as the New York network. Well, actually you can do it, but it won't do anything since the rule won't match. Now in this case, the parent rule would match our LA network, and sub-rules would then only be run within the context that they're matching the LA network. So therefore, adding a sub-rule with New York as the source simply wouldn't do anything. However, if the parent rule had the source left at any, which I have here, then adding in LA or New York or London would match as sub-rules, since these locations would of course be a match for the source of any. Alright, well, the final thing I want to talk about in this video is monitoring our quality of service traffic. But before we do that, we will first need to apply this policy to our gateway, since right now we've got a policy and we've got some rules, but we haven't yet installed it to our gateway. Now to do this, it's the same as we've done before. We're going to click up here on the install policy icon. I'll leave the defaults here as they are. We're just going to click on OK. And that policy will begin installing to our gateway. Alright, well it's done. Our policy's been installed, so we'll click Close. And now I'm going to head off to my desktop, and I'm going to fire up Smart View Monitor, and we'll need to enter in our password. Now on the left hand side, I'm going to expand traffic, and I'm going to select our top quality of service rules, and this is going to show us a new window here where we can choose what interface we want to monitor. And that interface will of course need to have QoS enabled for it. So there's our interface here. So we'll select that and click OK. And there's our graph. Now we will need to give our gateway something to do, so I'm going to fire up Internet Explorer here. And we'll start generating some HTTP traffic. So I'm going to head off to google.com. We'll fire up another browser here. We'll go to winstructor.com and we'll fire up one more, and we'll go to microsoft.com. Now let's go back to Smart View Monitor, and here we can see some live graphing taking place, which is pretty cool. And this of course gives us a method of finding out how our traffic is being affected by our QoS rules. So in this video we've talked about how to work with quality of service on the CheckPoint NGX R65 firewall. Remember, There's a lot to successfully putting together and deploying a solid QoS plan, but it's pretty easy to implement, as we've seen, and there can be many different ways of arriving at the same outcome. So just take the time to sit down and think about what it is that you're trying to achieve. For example, if you wanted to guarantee performance for your mail server, then you could add rules to match either the source or the destination of the mail server, or you could match mail protocols like SMTP and POP3. Now it's exactly that type of thinking that'll help you get CheckPoint up and running the way you want it, and the QoS rules do give you the flexibility to deploy it whichever way you like. So we hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for watching.